The afternoon sun shone brightly over London as tourists gathered near Buckingham Palace. People took pictures, admired the grand architecture, and watched the royal guard standing tall and still in their bright red uniforms and black bearskin hats. Among these disciplined guards was Thomas Kensington, a man known for his dedication and calm nature. He had been in the royal guard for years, trained to stand motionless, no matter what happened around him. He had faced everything from laughing tourists trying to make him flinch to children waving excitedly in his direction. Nothing ever broke his focus. But on this particular day, something unusual was about to happen. A man walked toward the palace gates, moving with an air of arrogance. His loud voice cut through the cheerful chatter of tourists. Some people turned their heads, noticing that he wasn't just a normal visitor. His face held a scowl, and his steps were filled with anger. In one hand, he held a leash attached to a large, muscular dog that pulled forward eagerly. The dog's ears were perked, and its deep growl made a few people nearby step back nervously. The man's eyes landed on Thomas, who remained perfectly still at his post. Something about Thomas seemed to make him angrier. He muttered something under his breath before stepping closer. The crowd around the palace sensed the tension. Some people moved away, while others watched in silent curiosity. At first, the man simply stood there, staring at Thomas as if waiting for a reaction. But Thomas had been trained for situations like this. He wasn't allowed to respond to distractions, no matter how frustrating or strange they were. His job was to stand firm and guard his post. The man's expression twisted with annoyance. "Standing there all stiff, huh?" he said loudly, his voice filled with mockery. "Think you're better than everyone else." Thomas didn't move. He had heard all kinds of remarks before. People often try to make guards react, hoping to catch a funny moment on camera. But this didn't feel like one of those harmless attempts. This man wasn't joking. There was something more intense behind his words. A few tourists exchanged uneasy glances. Some pulled out their phones, sensing that something wasn't right. The dog at the man's side growled again, its sharp teeth flashing as it tugged at the leash. The man seemed to enjoy the fear it caused. Then he took another step forward. The tension in the air thickened. The dog's growl grew louder. The man's grip on the leash tightened. And then, without warning, he did something that would leave the entire crowd in shock. The crowd around Buckingham Palace fell into an uneasy silence. People who had been chatting or taking photos just moments ago now stood frozen, their eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before them. The man with the dog was no longer just trying to get attention. His intentions seemed far more serious. Thomas Kensington remained still, just as he had been trained to do. His posture was perfect, his eyes focused straight ahead. But inside, he was fully aware of everything happening. He could hear the dog's deep growls, feel the man's aggressive energy, and sense the way the people around them were slowly stepping back, afraid of what might happen next. The man's voice broke through the silence again, louder this time. "You think you're so tough, standing there like a statue." He let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head as if he found the whole situation amusing. But his amusement wasn't shared by the people watching. They could see the way he gripped the dog's leash tightly, almost as if he was holding it back from something. Then, without warning, he loosened his grip. The dog, already tense and eager, saw this as a signal. With a fierce growl, it lunged forward, its powerful muscles propelling it straight toward Thomas. Gasps rang out from the crowd. A woman covered her mouth in shock. A man instinctively reached for his phone, unsure whether to record or call for help. For any ordinary person, this moment would have been terrifying. A large, aggressive dog, trained to obey harmful commands, was charging at full speed. But Thomas was not an ordinary person. He was a royal guard, trained to remain calm in the face of danger. As the dog leaped, its sharp teeth bared, Thomas moved, swiftly, but without panic. In one smooth motion, he shifted his stance, stepping to the side just enough to avoid the attack. The dog, expecting to make contact, found nothing but air. It landed heavily on the ground, momentarily disoriented. The man's expression flickered with surprise, but only for a second. He clenched his fists, his frustration growing. "Get him," he ordered, his voice sharp and commanding. The dog, trained to obey, quickly turned back around, its eyes locked on Thomas. It was ready to attack again, but something had changed. Thomas hadn't moved far, but now he was facing the dog directly. He stood firm, his gaze steady, his presence commanding. There was no fear in his eyes, no hesitation in his posture, just a quiet strength that even the dog seemed to recognize. The crowd held its breath. The dog hesitated for the briefest moment. And then something unexpected happened, something that no one in that crowd would ever forget. The air was thick with tension. The crowd watched in shock, their eyes darting between the aggressive dog and the royal guard who had barely moved. The dog had just missed its target, landing hard on the ground, but it quickly turned around, ready to attack again. The owner, standing a few feet away, smirked with satisfaction. He expected the dog to finish what it had started. But Thomas Kensington was not afraid. He had faced challenges before, though nothing quite like this. His years of training had prepared him for intense situations, but this was different. The dog wasn't just reacting on its own. It had been commanded to attack. Its growls rumbled like thunder, its body tense like a coiled spring, ready to launch forward at any moment. The crowd held their breath, waiting for what would happen next. Instead of panicking, Thomas remained perfectly still. His grip on his ceremonial rifle tightened, but he didn't lift it as a weapon. He didn't need to. He had been trained to use control, not force. He knew that sudden movements could trigger the dog even more. Instead, he used something even more powerful, his presence. The dog took another step forward, its sharp teeth flashing as it let out a deep warning growl. But as it locked eyes with Thomas, something unexpected happened. It hesitated. For the first time since being commanded to attack, the dog didn't immediately lunge. It stood there, muscles tight, breathing heavy, but its eyes flickered with uncertainty. It was as if it could sense something different about the man in front of it. Thomas wasn't afraid. He wasn't running. He wasn't reacting with aggression. The owner frowned, clearly frustrated. "What are you waiting for? Get him," he shouted again, jerking the leash as if to push the dog forward. The dog flinched but didn't move right away. Thomas finally made his first move. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered his eyes slightly, breaking direct eye contact with the dog just for a moment. Enough to show that he wasn't a threat. Then he shifted his grip on his rifle, keeping it close to his body, but still firm. He took a deep, steady breath. The dog let out another growl, but this time it was softer. Its ears twitched, and for the first time, it looked away from Thomas and back at its owner, confused. The owner's face turned red with anger. He pulled harshly on the leash, trying to force the dog forward again. But something had changed. The dog, once so eager to obey, was now hesitating. It could sense something in Thomas: calmness, strength, control. And for the first time, it wasn't sure if it wanted to continue the attack. The crowd, still silent, started to realize what was happening. Something incredible was about to unfold right before their eyes. A strange silence filled the air. The crowd stood frozen, eyes wide with anticipation. The dog, which had been moments away from attacking, now hesitated. Its deep growls softened, its breathing slowed. Something had changed, though no one could quite understand why. The owner's grip on the leash tightened, his face twisted with frustration. "What are you doing?" "I said get him." He barked at the dog, jerking the leash sharply. The dog flinched but did not move forward. Thomas Kensington remained as steady as ever. His heart was calm, his breathing even. He had learned that fear and aggression only created more chaos. But control, true control, came from something deeper. He wasn't just standing there as a soldier. He was reading the dog, understanding its hesitation. With slow, deliberate movements, Thomas shifted his rifle slightly, not in defense, but in a way that signaled he was not a threat. He held his ground but did not challenge the dog. His steady gaze, his strong yet calm presence, was doing something remarkable. The dog took a step back. The crowd gasped. No one had expected this. A moment ago, the dog had been full of rage, ready to attack. Now, it was uncertain. Its ears twitched, its tail flicked slightly, and it kept glancing between Thomas and its owner as if questioning what to do next. Thomas made his first move. Slowly, he lowered his rifle just a little and took a deep, controlled breath. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His body language was enough. The dog responded by letting out a short, uncertain whimper. The owner was furious now. "What's wrong with you?" he growled, pulling the leash hard. But this time, the dog did something unexpected. It resisted. Instead of lunging at Thomas, it took another step back. Murmurs spread through the crowd. People whispered to each other, trying to make sense of what was happening. A few even pulled out their phones, realizing they were witnessing something extraordinary. The dog was trained to attack. It had followed its owner's commands without question before. But now, in front of Thomas, it hesitated. It sensed something different in him, something strong, but not aggressive. The owner yanked the leash one last time, but the dog let out a low whimper and refused to move forward. Thomas stood firm, unmoving, his presence alone commanding respect. He had not raised a weapon, not fought back, yet he had won this battle without ever striking a blow. The crowd, watching in stunned silence, suddenly erupted into murmurs of amazement. Some people even started clapping softly, unable to believe what they had just seen. The owner, realizing he was losing control, looked around in frustration. His plan had failed. But what he didn't know was that his trouble was only just beginning. A tense silence filled the air. The dog, once filled with aggression, now stood still, ears twitching, unsure of what to do. Its body no longer showed the same eagerness to attack. It had sensed something in Thomas, something calm, something strong. It had obeyed orders its entire life. But now, for the first time, it hesitated. The owner's face turned red with frustration. His plan had backfired in front of an entire crowd. He had expected the dog to attack instantly, to create a scene, to get the reaction he wanted. But now, people were whispering, staring, recording on their phones. This was not how things were supposed to go. Anger flared in his eyes. With a sharp pull, he yanked the leash again, harder this time. The dog let out a small whimper but didn't move forward. Instead, it glanced at Thomas, its tail lowering slightly as if confused. The owner's grip tightened, his knuckles turning white. He was losing control, and he knew it. The crowd, sensing the shift in power, began murmuring louder. A few people in the front took cautious steps forward. A woman holding a phone shook her head and said, "That's enough." Others nodded in agreement. The energy in the air had changed. The people weren't afraid anymore. They were watching closely, waiting for justice. And then it happened. A group of uniformed officers moved swiftly through the crowd, their faces serious. They had been watching from a distance, observing every move. Now they stepped in with purpose. One officer, tall and firm, spoke in a clear, commanding voice. "Sir, step away from the guard and drop the leash." The owner's head snapped up in shock. He hadn't realized that security had been nearby the entire time. His eyes darted around, looking for a way out. "What? I didn't do anything," he protested, forcing a laugh. "It's just a dog." The officer didn't let him finish. "We've seen enough," he said firmly. "You are under arrest for public disturbance and reckless endangerment." The crowd gasped. People exchanged glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others nodding in approval. The owner's smug expression disappeared instantly. His eyes widened as two officers stepped forward and took hold of his arms. "Wait, you can't do this," he shouted, struggling against their grip. But it was too late. The officers moved quickly, securing his hands and leading him away. His protests turned into angry mutters as he was guided through the crowd. People moved aside, watching as justice took its course. Meanwhile, the dog stood still, ears down, as if realizing its fate had changed, too. One of the officers gently reached for the leash, speaking in a calm voice. The dog hesitated for a moment, but did not resist. Its aggressive posture was gone. It had stopped seeing the world through commands and force. It had felt something different today. And as the owner was taken away, the crowd turned back to Thomas Kensington, the man who had faced danger without lifting a weapon. And for the first time that day, people didn't just watch him in silence. They applauded. The sound of applause grew louder, spreading through the crowd like a wave. People clapped not just for the officers who had stepped in, but for Thomas Kensington, the royal guard who had faced danger with nothing but calm strength. He had not moved in fear. He had not fought back in anger. And yet, he had won. Thomas, still standing at his post, did not react to the cheers. His duty was clear. He was a royal guard, and guards did not respond to distractions. But inside, he felt a quiet sense of pride. Not for himself, but for the way things had turned out. No violence, no unnecessary harm. Only control, discipline, and the unexpected power of calmness. Meanwhile, the officers escorted the angry man away, his protests growing weaker as he realized there was nothing he could do. The crowd watched as he disappeared from view. Some shook their heads, some whispered about what had happened, and a few turned their attention back to something unexpected. The dog. The large dog, which had moments ago been ready to attack, now stood quietly beside an officer. Its body was no longer tense, and its ears were no longer pulled back in aggression. It looked different, as if it, too, had realized something had changed. A woman from the crowd stepped forward. "What will happen to the dog?" she asked gently. It was a question on many people's minds. The dog had been used as a tool for harm, but it wasn't truly at fault. It had only followed the harsh commands of its owner. One of the officers, still holding the leash, gave a reassuring nod. "We'll take care of it," he said. "It's not the dog's fault. With the right care, it can be rehabilitated." A few people sighed in relief. Others nodded, glad to hear that the dog wouldn't suffer because of its owner's actions. The officer knelt slightly and spoke to the dog in a low, calm voice. The dog hesitated, then wagged its tail, just a little. It was the first sign of trust it had shown all day. The tension in the air slowly faded. Tourists who had been frozen in shock now started moving again. Some still watched Thomas with admiration, while others quietly talked about what they had just witnessed. Many of them would leave that day with an. As the crowd slowly returned to their usual activities, the moment still hung in the air. People whispered about what had happened, replaying the scene in their minds. Some continued to glance at Thomas Kensington, their respect for him growing. Even though he had not spoken a single word or reacted in anger, he had done something extraordinary. The officers led the dog away carefully. It walked beside them, calmer now, as if sensing that the worst was over. People watched with relief, knowing that it would be given a chance at a better life. It would no longer be under the control of a man who had used it for the wrong reasons. Nearby, a woman holding her phone turned to another bystander. "Did you record that?" she asked, her voice full of excitement. "People need to see this." The man beside her nodded. "I did. The way the guard handled everything, it was unbelievable." Within minutes, videos of the incident started spreading online. People who had been there began sharing their experiences, describing how a royal guard had stopped an attack without lifting a hand. The internet quickly took notice. Some called him a hero, while others admired his discipline and control. The story of Thomas Kensington and the aggressive dog was reaching far beyond Buckingham Palace. Meanwhile, Thomas remained at his post, as steady as ever. He knew that people were talking about him. He could hear their whispers, feel their eyes on him. But he did not react. His training had taught him well. No distractions, no unnecessary movements. He was there to serve, to protect, and to uphold tradition. However, among the crowd, there was one person who couldn't stay silent. A young girl, no older than 10, tugged at her mother's sleeve and pointed toward Thomas. "Mom, I want to say thank you," she said softly. Her mother hesitated. "Sweetheart, the guards don't respond to people. They have to stay still." But the girl was determined. She took a step forward, then another. Clutching the small British flag in her hands, she stopped a few feet away from Thomas and looked up at him with wide, admiring eyes. "Thank you for being so brave," she said. Her voice was small but filled with sincerity. For a long moment, there was silence. The crowd waited, wondering if Thomas would break his stillness. But he didn't. He remained in position, his expression unchanged. Then, just as the mother was about to gently pull her daughter away, something subtle but powerful happened. Thomas, without moving his head or shifting his stance, slowly and deliberately blinked. It was the smallest gesture, one that most people wouldn't even notice, but the girl's face lit up with joy. She had been acknowledged. Her mother smiled, holding her daughter's hand as they walked away. And in that simple moment, Thomas had given them something to remember forever. As the little girl walked away with her mother, a warm feeling spread through the crowd. People smiled, some whispering about the moment they had just witnessed. A simple blink, nothing more, nothing less, but it had meant everything. It was a small sign, a quiet acknowledgement from Thomas Kensington, the royal guard who had shown true strength that day. The day moved on, but the story was far from over. The videos taken by witnesses spread quickly on social media. Within hours, news outlets picked up the story. Headlines appeared everywhere. "Royal Guard's unshakable discipline shocks aggressive man," and "bravery without violence, how a guard stood his ground." People from all over the world watched the footage. They saw how Thomas had faced the dog without fear, how he had remained calm despite the danger. Many praised his discipline, his courage, and his ability to defuse the situation without force. Others were amazed by how the dog, once aggressive, had changed in the presence of his calm strength. Soon, Thomas Kensington's name was being talked about everywhere. His fellow guards at Buckingham Palace heard the news, proud to see one of their own being recognized. Even high-ranking officials took notice, impressed by how he had handled the situation. Meanwhile, the authorities made sure the right actions were taken. The man who had set the dog on Thomas was charged with multiple offenses. His actions had been reckless and dangerous, and now he would face the consequences. Justice was being served. As for the dog, it was taken to a rescue center, where experts would help it recover from its past training. Many people online asked about the dog, hoping it would find a new home. Some even offered to adopt it, wanting to give it a fresh start. It was no longer a tool of aggression. It was now just an animal in need of kindness. Back at Buckingham Palace, Thomas continued his duty as always. He did not let the sudden attention change him. Even when tourists tried to catch his eye or waved their phones excitedly, he remained as still and disciplined as ever. One afternoon, a fellow guard quietly walked up to him during a shift change. "You know," he said in a low voice, "you've become a bit of a legend." Thomas, still staring straight ahead, gave no visible reaction. But deep inside, he felt a quiet sense of pride, not for fame, but for the way everything had turned out. He had stood his ground, kept his discipline, and proved that true strength didn't come from aggression, but from control. As the sun set over Buckingham Palace, life moved on. But for those who had been there that day, the story of Thomas Kensington, the royal guard who faced danger with nothing but calmness, would never be forgotten. And somewhere in the city, a little girl still smiled, knowing she had been part of something truly special.